So this idea that like we should have like immutable algorithms that like define the contours of our economy or define the contours of law, or they become these like things that like nobody can change. That's like to me, I'm like, I think that's like epistemically authoritarianism, because it's like taking it's basically saying there's certain conversations that are off the table, that like technology has its own logic. Like, what if we're wrong? We were wrong about the neoliberal project. What if we're wrong about 21 million Bitcoins? Like, what if that like fucks everything up and then we can't change it?
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value, a place for asking questions about freedom, money, and creativity. My guest today is Mike Brock. Mike writes extensively on his Substack, Notes from the Circus, about democracy, liberalism, and what he sees as the decline of the American Republic. Mike has an extensive tech background, formerly working as an executive at Cash App, as well as being involved with various open source projects. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You recently wrote, "We're living through a moment when the old frameworks for meaning-making are collapsing and new ones haven't yet stabilized. This creates both danger and opportunity. Danger that people will retreat into authoritarian simplicity or nihilistic despair, an opportunity to create something better than what came before." This seems to be a nod to something similar that Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci wrote in his prison notebooks in the 1930s, on the eve of the rise of fascism in Italy. Mike, what events or experiences have brought you to this place of questioning?
I mean, I've had a lifelong affliction, which has been an obsession with trying to understand the world. I mean, it's served me in my business pursuits, in my previous capacity. It took me into software engineering, in and out of politics. I was a business executive, and now I'm a writer. But like fundamentally, yeah, I mean, I've had a life that's been really focused on trying to understand the world, and one where I've been in search of like purpose and meaning, and trying to find some sort of like way to contribute, right, to the story. I mean, as Walt Whitman said, that we can all contribute a verse, right? That's what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to understand that story that I'm contributing to.
Yeah, if I might, just going back a little bit, Mike, where are you originally from?
I was born in Canada, I guess you could say that I'm an American Canadian. I've spent most of my adult existence here, south of the Canadian-U.S. border. But I've been I guess you could say I'm a North American native.
Did you find that growing up in Canada, I mean, how long did you spend there? Did it sort of affect your outlook on politics?
Well, it's interesting, right? I mean, growing up in Canada is, I'm very obvious. I'm a somewhat pretty much identified, I guess, now as an American political commentator. But I mean, if we're going to put back that far into my history, yeah, I mean, it's interesting growing up in the shadow of a superpower, right across the border. It's impossible to not notice the cultural, political, and economic influence of a creature such as the United States, which is my adopted home. I'm a citizen here as well. I'm a proud citizen of this country. I fell in love with this country, actually, and became a citizen. And I'm a patriotic one. I have an American flag right there, right behind me. And so, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting experience, actually, seeing the United States from the outside. It gives you a different perspective, obviously. I mean, you're outside the United States yourself. And when we can get into conversations about U.S. foreign policy, adventures and misadventures, and the moral stories that we all tell about the 20th century and like before that, and we can go back further, and and talk about, like, the foundations of this country. And some people would say that I'm remiss if I don't mention the history of slavery in this country. But yet, I mean, this project of America is something that yeah, I mean, I don't know when I fell in love with America. Maybe I did as a kid, and the promise of it, the promise of something that has a capacity to literally reach for the stars, through this experiment of self-government, and which obviously, like, brings us to today, and the despair that I'm fighting against in my writings.
Yeah, well, I'm keen to explore that a little bit more, and I think this is something we might share in common, Mike, because I'm originally from New Zealand, which a tiny country, South Pacific. Again, people often don't know where it is, and it sort of gets confused with somewhere like Australia. And again, there's a geopolitical fold where New Zealand's only got one ally, which happens to be Australia, formerly. We've sort of distanced ourselves from the United States, but we're also very much within that sphere of influence. And so from the outside, I guess we get to look at this thing very from an interesting perspective, right? And coming to this point of despair that you mentioned, and certainly you're writing on Notes from the Circus since late 2024, seems to increasingly be focusing on what's happening in the United States government, challenges that you see to the democracy itself, to the republic itself. And I wonder, maybe just tell me a bit more about where your thinking's at with that.
Where my thinking is at with the state of democracy.
Yeah, man.
If here in the United States, I mean, we're in a crisis. I believe that what we are seeing is an attempted slow motion coup that is being perpetrated by the current occupant of the executive branch, the Article 2 branch of the United States federal government, which is currently headed by Donald J. Trump and his vice president, J.D. Vance, and assorted oligarchs around them. I would look at this current situation such as it is, and I would say that this represents these people represent an existential threat to that thing that I was telling you about earlier that I love so much.
Yeah. So there's this idea of America, right? And this, perhaps you could say, founding myth, the founding fathers, these innovations in governance. Yet here we are today. You're writing about this stuff. You seem to certainly have the tone of crisis, of concern in your writing. It seems like your articles are really speaking to this. But on the other hand, I've just spent a little bit of time with the works of Adam Shrivorsky, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but a couple of years ago wrote Crisis of Democracy. And, looking through that, his outlook on the state of democracy in the United States was a little bit less concerned than you are, given the state of the economy, the long history of democracy and successful transitions of power. He seemed to think that it was more like 1 in 1.8 million country years chance that democracy would fail in the United States. So what has changed since that book came out 2019?
Well, we can talk about this a little bit. I mean, I'm somebody who has actually been very much involved, actually, for some time in pro-democracy activism, not just in the United States but around the world. And this has been a long time passion of mine, not a new thing. When I started Notes from the Circus, what I would say is that yes, I mean, the United States has a very deep democratic culture, and there's a lot of reasons for hope. There's a lot of reasons to believe that democracy will persist in the United States. Now, we should be precise here, though, when I say that, right? I mean, there's a very strong cultural current. People expect to be able to vote for their politicians. They expect their votes to be counted, the results of those elections to be respected and ratified and reified in composing the representatives in the legislatures and offices to which those elections are held for. And I think yes, I think it would be very, very difficult for Donald Trump and his merry band of corrupt oligarchs, and they are corrupt oligarchs, by the way, um, to completely undo the cultural and institutional inertia that makes that true. However, we have to understand something, though. I mean, the authoritarians understand this. They do understand that removing the expectation of free and fair elections is not something that they're going to be able to do in any short period of time. Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party in Hungary understands this too. Erdogan in Turkey understands this. Modi in India understands this. People aren't paying much attention, but like Scheinbaum and her, left-wing reactionary populist post-truth forces in Mexico understand this. There's a new class of authoritarianism. It comes in both, as we see in Mexico, of sort of, left reactionary and right reactionary varieties. In the United States, it's very much on the right side of that equation, where they have sort of figured something out. They've figured out, as Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban have demonstrated to the world, that the way that you can establish a dictatorship inside a democracy is by fundamentally chipping away at the process, like not necessarily like the process of voting, but everything around that, the eligibility to run for election, the way things are counted, like why they're counted, who can stand for election, capturing the courts so they can make determinations on what votes to count and which ones not to. These are the ways in which, like, the modern, more sophisticated authoritarian goes about consolidating control. And this is exactly what Donald Trump and the people around him, and people like this Vought guy who runs the Office of Management and Budget, is laser focused on those sorts of things, thinking about ways in which to not get rid of the ritual of voting, like in that strict sense, because obviously that's deeply ingrained in our sense of what political legitimacy means in the modern world. But they do want to strip it of liberal values and any kind of concept of like universal rule of law. They want rule by the powerful with performative elections. And so that's like so yes, like there's this tension there, this truth that people culturally are very attached to, that sort of procedural democracy. And that's good. That gives us something to work with, but it doesn't change the fact that there's like a formula that these fascists, these modern fascists, have for wrestling the democracy to the ground by hollowing it of its content, rather than actually destroying the actual process by which we legitimate our leaders. And that's their game, and that's what they're doing. And so I get people. I get the perspective that says that they're not going to be able to eliminate elections, but I don't think they're going to try to eliminate elections. I think they're going to try to make the elections not matter. That's the nuanced point that has to be understood. And so I kind of think it's like, kind of a sense. It's sort of this like. I mean, I'm not saying that the academic that you cited there, and I'm not familiar with his work, but I am familiar with like the work of other people, that focus on democratic decline, and I would say that most of those people in that world are very alarmed and probably more aligned with what I'm saying than the figure that you cited.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, again, this was 2019, so sort of from Trump 1 era. Mm-hmm. But so just pulling on that thread, so something else I believe you've written about here is that the fascist propagandist understands that human attention is finite. We can only focus on so many things at once. By creating constant noise around peripheral issues, they ensure the central crime, the actual seizure of power, goes relatively unscrutinized. And I think this speaks to something I want to get onto, which is this idea of epistemology. What is knowledge? What is truth? What do things even mean? And this seems to be one of the central issues that we're in today. What is even happening, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, right? What is knowledge? What is truth, right? Epistemology obviously is the word that we sort of use in philosophy and um, in the sciences to sort of like categorize that sort of object that you're raising here. Um, yeah, I mean, it's something we don't think about, but it's very fundamental to us, actually, right? I mean, the nature of our consciousness lives there, right? I mean, in the world of the sort of like thought and information and communication, and there's there's a theory of consciousness which I'm partial to, right? This idea of like the social self, right? That we actually exist sort of consciously in what you might think of as an intersubjective realm, right? Because which doesn't really come intuitively to us because we want to think of ourselves as autonomous agents. I have a brain, you have a brain. We're not, I'm not suggesting that we like communicate to each other through, you know, uh, you know, telepathy or anything. But when we talk to each other, we sort of exchange like fragments of consciousness. And when we're not talking to each other, we're absorbing cultural artifacts and words and meanings and all of these idioms and all of these things around us that sort of become part of our shared context that sort of exists outside us, that we exist in relation to. And then you get even like more deeper into this and you think about like the theories of Girard and like mimetic theory and like how sort of like the things that we care about are based on sort of imitating things that exist in that space. And so yeah, like epistemology is that, right? It's sort of the maybe the most important word, if you ask me, in the age of AI, at sort of the thing, the sort of knowledge and science that like more people should really understand. Because when you're thinking about questions like how will we survive the age of AI, like how will humans stay human? I mean, that's like really those are epistemological challenges, really, right? Like both in like how you design the AI and how you understand how the AI works, and like the nature of the communication between the AI and the humans. We obviously worry about the threat of manipulation and like the highly effective propaganda that AI will be able to met out against us and manipulate us and subjugate us. Those are all epistemological challenges. And understanding how like knowledge and information and truth and communication actually works is really crucial to at least having an intuitive understanding about like what the risks are and like what we should care about and like how we should go about designing safe technology that serves humans rather than humans being enslaved by machines, which is of course the thing that we all worry about as we talk about the coming AI age that we are heading, head first into.
Yeah, interesting. Well, look, I mean, I appreciate you haven't encountered this work by Adam Pravorsky, but I did want to reference it because, again, that opening quote that I mentioned, he actually says the very similar thing that Gramsci had talked about in the opening chapter. And he's very well known, Adam Pravorsky, for this idea that democracy is simply a system in which the incumbents lose elections and they leave when they lose. And he's done, again, a lot of study in this space. And his reflections on Trump, one at least, was that something is happening. Anti-establishment, anti-system, anti-elite, this kind of populist sentiment which is exploding in mature democracies globally. And I do feel, Mike, that there is some kind of connection here with this relationship with truth and reality, because it seems like everything's upside down. What was historically the bourgeoisie has become the party of the proletariat, the Republicans and the Conservatives, and on the other hand, the party of the working man, the working person, the Labour parties, the left-wing parties of the world have become, in a sense, the bourgeoisie and the laptop class. And so there's kind of some sort of populist sentiment going on, and in a sense, is it that's being led by someone such as Trump, or is that they're simply feeding on this broader sentiment that's emerging?
Good question. And I write a lot about this as well. So I mean, when we think about the situation that we're, I mean, I mean, I agree with the analysis that there's, obviously the loss of faith and in the establishment, the populist moment, the sort of collapse of confidence in institutions and trust in institutions, um, is a real phenomenon, and it is a phenomenon that is a product of convergent factors, really. Um, there are criticism, like, we can talk about, say, the liberal establishment, right? That this sort of that, you know, I mean, it's still kind of hanging on in places. I'd say that, like, Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom is like part of the old guard liberal establishment. Macron, like, people, like surprisingly, they have we know uh, Mark Carney in Canada, who just became prime minister, former Bank of England and Bank of Canada governor, is clearly like liberal establishment type figure. And that group of people, right? The Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, um, that liberal establishment, I mean, has lost trust. I mean, the trust has been lost in that establishment. And that, obviously, I would actually, like, extend that to, the sort of what some people sometimes refer to as, like, the neoconservatives, the sorts of the sort of people who were in power of the Republican establishment before the rise of Trump. I would consider them part of the liberal establishment, the small L liberal. I use liberal in the classical sense. Like, I would say that, like, Ronald Reagan was a liberal, Bill Clinton was a liberal, George W. Bush was a liberal, Obama was a liberal. There was different types of liberals, right? Reagan was more, Reagan was like a right-leaning liberal, and Bill Clinton was actually kind of a right-leaning liberal too in the 90s. He was kind of like an aberration who had, some sort of like left-leaning views. And then you had, Bush, who was kind of like a weird sort of like, mix. It was like this compassionate conservatism. And Obama was like, like pretty much as vanilla establishment liberal as, packaged in a, I think a really, really amazing politician in Barack Obama, who was able to sort of like, command a soaring message. I mean, I don't think he was as effective as a president as he promised, unfortunately, but an amazing politician, an inspiring leader. But that group of people represent, I think, in the cultural ethos, right? A sort of a failed promise, right? And you get into these issues that people have with globalization, deindustrialization of the U.S. Midwest is often like discussed as like being connected to this, like the China shock in the early 2000s after China was invited into the World Trade Organization. And this whole sort of like, architecture of sort of political coherence has been brought into disrepute, for many reasons. The 2008 financial crisis was a major catalyst for the collapse of confidence in this what sometimes people call this neoliberal project, which arguably started with Reagan in the 80s and ended with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and that yes, I mean, the people have lost trust in that on both the left and the right, actually, right? I mean, the Bernie coalition and like sort of the progressive left has been trying to reject that from the left for a while, and that has now been completely rejected by the right in the United States. You've seen, you see the sort of the right-wing liberals and the left-wing liberals have sort of kind of come together, the Liz Cheneys of the world and the Bill Kristols of the world have sort of like, basically joined forces with the left-wing liberals. And so you do have these like this sort of like new kind of like liberal coalition that's sort of like holding together. But yeah, I mean that the broader public has lost complete faith in that project. And obviously, I'm an apologist for that project because I am a liberal like philosopher, and so I am very much trying to re-enchant liberalism in the eyes of people. And I recognize that I'm representing an ideology that most people think has failed. People believe liberalism has failed. I think that's a mistaken conclusion based on some things that I think liberals need to take account of. Like, I think liberals need to admit like certain failures of the neoliberal project, for example. They have to admit that there were costs to globalization, that cultural costs to globalization, even if not, purely, you know, in sort of in aggregate, like, irrational economically. There was sort of there was something there that liberals sort of missed. And one of the things that happened over the last 20 years was that liberal establishment, because it was so successful, right? Like, Francis Fukuyama, talked, called it the end of history, right? The sort of the triumph, right, of liberalism in the world after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Berlin Wall came down. It was just like, up until 2016, right? It was almost impossible, if you sort of were in that world, in that establishment, part of that elite, to imagine that anyone would ever vote to bring this system down. And in 2016, Brexit and right before Trump's election, and then Trump's election revealed something that I don't think people really accepted, actually, until now, until this moment. Actually, I think Donald Trump's re-election, I think, has been really the first time. I think in 2016 people still thought Trump was an aberration. I think now there's serious conversations happening now, like, among people who kind of recognize that, like, liberalism is not considered, like, most people don't sort of think of it as as an ideology that really should be governing the world anymore. For different reasons, the left thinks that liberalism failed because of globalization and capitalism run amok. The right thinks liberalism failed because of, like, cultural issues, cultural excess in the form of, like, hyper identity politics. Some people call it wokeism. And so there's this sort of, like, two front, like, attack, right? That basically said the right wing reactionaries are saying liberalism failed for cultural reasons, and the left is saying that and actually also for economic reasons. And the left, obviously, the socialist left and the progressive left, is saying liberalism failed for economic reasons, and also because it obviously failed to stand up to this fascist threat that we now stand. And so that's, to me, like, that's sort of how I would sort of broad brush, like, talk about, like, what I think sort of in broad strokes, and you can talk about other parts of the world as well, but in the United States, I would say that's where we find ourselves. That's our kind of quick history of sort of the political currents.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's interesting, again, that just referencing Trump 1 and Adam Pravorsky, he said this crisis is not just political, it has deep roots in the economy and in society, which I think encompasses what you just said, sort of dissatisfaction on all sides. And it's interesting, though, for me, I want to just clarify here, you identify as a liberal, but you're also embracing the neoliberal project, which, in a sense, I mean, they share a name, but there is a kind of critique that those are sort of quite different things.
When you say I embrace the neoliberal project, can you, like, maybe, like, be precise about why you say that?
Oh, it said, so you said you're holding up the liberal ideology, and then you go on to sort of talk about neoliberalism as if it's a continuation of the classical liberalism. And I just want to clarify that. Like, is that what you mean?
Well, look here. So, like, I mean, we need to be clear, right? Like, so, when I say I'm a liberal, right, I'm talking about a very, very deep philosophical political tradition that is not that is fundamentally based on the idea of human dignity and and self-government and universal rights, universal suffrage, these like basic concepts of the basic concept that nobody is more valuable than anyone else. And so to the extent that we structure our societies, we should build institutions that protect those sort of core inviolable ethical principles, right? This is sort of the liberal idea, the Enlightenment classical liberal idea. And there is where I say I am a liberal. Now, from there's a bunch of projects within the liberal tradition. You mentioned neoliberalism, right? This is, there's other ways that you can describe this aspect of liberalism. Someone might call it market fundamentalism, in its more extreme form, like anarcho-capitalism, which, like my philosopher friend Vlad Vexler would say, is hyper neoliberalism. And those ideas are built upon that sort of like core set of like summum bonum notions of liberalism. But like within liberalism, right, there's like obviously disagreements, right? Like Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a liberal. He was a democratic liberal, believed that, he believed capitalism should exist, but it should be regulated by the state. And competition laws should exist, and the market isn't an end unto itself. And those liberals are liberals too, and they disagree with other liberals. So the views on like how much you should regulate the market or not are not things that all liberals agree upon. Like I say, like Reagan was a liberal in that classical sense. Everything he said is consistent with liberal values. That makes him a liberal. Margaret Thatcher was a classical liberal as well. And they took a particular view that, socialism and central planning was like a disaster in the 20th century, which it was a disaster. I mean, in the case of like the United Kingdom and, sort of the nationalized industries there that were super inefficient, and the economy was like stagnant. There was this sort of realization that like the market would do a much better job at allocating resources through price discovery and a free market. And so we saw the deregulation of the 80s and 90s, which led to, a massive economic boom, both in the West and around the world. And that, now there's this sort of what people think was sort of an overreach there. And so, like, I mean, I'm like I would say like I'm in the middle of this actual argument. Like, I actually think that most of the regulatory reforms that happened in the 80s, like in the UK, for example, like in Thatcher's project, were probably necessary. Like the government-run companies were like super fucking inefficient, and like the country was like economically stagnant. But then, then there's that, but what we've realized, right, is that like I don't think that there is that the fact that deregulation proved that markets are better than governments at running industries didn't prove that we should get rid of all regulations. It just proved that like, we shouldn't have the government like monopolizing sectors. That made sense. So Thatcher brought an end to that. I mean, I think there are some sectors that the government can probably monopolize. That's probably like good. Like, I think like, like basic utilities. Like I live here in Los Angeles, and the city of Los Angeles is responsible for all power and water here. So, I mean, this is all, socialist power here in Los Angeles. I mean, I think that's fine. But I think, yeah, I mean, do we want governments like making like our clothing for us and our cars? I think no. I think the neoliberals were right in the 80s that's like stupid. Don't fucking do that. It's gonna make us all poor and like and poorly allocate resources. But I think there's like, but then I think there's like other, like as the 2008 financial crisis showed us, is that like, well, I mean, you shouldn't like necessarily let market actors do whatever the fuck they want either. I mean, if they're gonna create like 10 layers deep, like, crazy dark financial instruments that are all all linked to each other in a way that nobody even knows what the total picture looks like, you might blow up the entire fucking economy. And maybe don't let banks do that. Maybe have some regulations against that. I'm kind of like you maybe a little bit like between the neoliberals and the more sort of like, left sort of economic views within the liberal coalition, where I'm kind of like, you guys are like both right about some things, that like maybe the real answer is that we should regulate things that have uncaptured externalities by the market. We should just do that. Like, makes sense. We shouldn't regulate things that don't have those conditions, because that's stupid. Just let the market do its job. We should potentially ban the market from doing certain things that could get us all killed. I don't think it should be legal to create a super virus, now off of a gene printer. I think if you do that and we catch you doing that, we should throw you in jail. Don't do that. I think that, I kind of come back to this sort of, conversation around how to like think about liberalism in a, somewhat pragmatic way there, right? I think we need to acknowledge the criticisms of the neoliberal project, of sort of the downsides of globalization, which we can talk about, which I think like have really distorted our political economy and have actually imperiled our democratic project, which I don't think the neoliberals ever really wanted to do, by the way. I don't think there's anything. If Milton Friedman were alive today, I think he would be quite like horrified, actually, because I think he would have been pretty anti-Trump, from what I read about him. So, that I think that it needs to be understood that there's a conversation there within the liberal project that from which there's disagreement, and from where I think that like we can learn and move forward without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And conversation, dialogues are obviously very important here, because there is a lot of nuance, and it's not super well known, but Thatcher and Reagan were sort of the two key figures that people think of when it comes to neoliberalism. But actually in New Zealand as well, in the 1980s, it was a real experimental place, and we had our finance minister Roger Douglas effectively upend the entire economy with accelerated neoliberalism, and arguably for the better. My grandmother tells me about, there was one place where you could buy televisions, and it was a government department, and now New Zealand's a very open, prosperous economy for the most part, and so there was certainly good outcomes for that, but there was also a lot of pain.
It was everywhere. It was actually everywhere in the world, right? Tony Blair was basically like a neoliberal. That's what third way socialism was. Basically, it was basically like socialists like rebranding neoliberalism for the left, and so that's how you get like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and in Canada, you have you get like John Chrétien and Paul Martin, actually kind of in China too, right? Like, you get like Dao Xingping, right? And he like basically, creates the special economic zone in Shenzhen, and the rest is like history there. And so, there was like the neoliberal moment in the 80s was kind of like all over the world.
Yeah, zeitgeist. I do want to come back though to 2008 in particular, because you previously worked for Cash App as a tech executive. You helped set up the Spiral open source grant program, and you've been deeply involved with Bitcoin in this regard. But you've also repeatedly made public announcements of Bitcoin and crypto. And so I'm just
haven't
wondering,
actually denounced Bitcoin. I want to be clear about this. I want to I've been very clear about this. I haven't attacked Bitcoin as a technology. If you can read all my tweets and everything I said, in fact, I think if you read the essays that I wrote, I was pretty clear that I was, at least in both of them, I at least had a few sentences there making clear that I wasn't actually talking about the technology itself, but the cultural aesthetics around it, with a lot of people who work in the industry. Now with crypto though, as sort of like a general sort of sense, I've been I'm pretty critical of the industry and very skeptical that it's not all just like fraud.
Okay, well let's talk about that, and thank you for that clarification. So you were working with Cash App, you were a tech person. What happened, man? Like you got close to the beast and you saw it for what it was. Like, how did you come to this place where you're asking questions about what this stuff really means.
When you say I got close to the beast, what do you mean by that? Like
I don't know, man. Like what are the power brokers of the crypto world, the Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, there's like, look, I mean, there's like a lot of good people. I mean, that, I mean, I don't like everyone in like Bitcoin, like who works with Bitcoin is not fascist. I mean, to be very clear, like I know plenty of people, like I talk to them all the time, right? They're not fascists. But I mean, a lot of the loud voices in the Bitcoin, I mean, like Saifedean is a fascist, right? Like he is, right? Like he's a fascist. I mean, if you if you read the last like half of like the Bitcoin Standard, it's like, he's talking about like degenerate art and shit. Like, I mean, this, like, have you read Mein Kampf? Like Hitler talks about degenerate art too. And actually, like, people who've like read the German translation of it will tell you that it's kind of a bit disturbing. So I mean, and he's obviously anti-democracy. He promotes the view of Hans Hermann Hoppe, which is fascist. And he's a lot of people in sort of that Austrian economics world are fascists, and he's a fascist. No one seems to like believe this or know this, but like if you're actually like educated in political ideologies and histories and stuff like that, and you read the last half of the Bitcoin Standard, you're like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Like he's talking about like cultural aesthetics and stuff like, and sort of this kind of like getting back to sort of like these sort of like classical sort of like traditions and like restoring these like this sort of like lost age. Like, do you know who talks like that? Fascists. I just bring that up because like everyone, and actually like a lot of people in Bitcoin know this. Like I talked to, I went to the Bitcoin conferences and I've talked to people, and people will like privately agree with you. They'll be, yeah, he's a fascist. He's like crazy. He like blocks everyone on Twitter who like disagrees with him. But no one will say it publicly. No one, like, there's a lot of people like that will work in it will agree with me, but they won't say what I'm saying. Like I'm saying right now, like, ooh, speaking truth. And so there's this sort of like, decorum within Bitcoin that like, you don't just like actually like call out like the obvious fucking like reality that there's a bunch of fucking fat. I mean, you see how excited like Bitcoin Magazine and the Bitcoin conference got like when Donald Trump came last night. They basically like pulled up all the stuff. They basically became part of his election campaign. I mean, that was disturbing. Like they should be ashamed of themselves. So yeah, I mean I'm very critical of this, and it made people very uncomfortable that I said all these things, and I'm sure someone will hear this and they'll be very upset that I'm saying these things. But like, I mean, it's just the reality. I mean, just own it. Like, there's a lot of people who think that like democracy sucks, that we should live in fucking anarcho-capitalist world, which is really just a feudalist world. It's really just it's a form of fascism, really. Like, most of them think that we should probably have a dictator, a king. That's what Saifedean believes. It's what Hans Hermann Hoppe believes, which all these like, Austrian motherfuckers believe. It's like, and you want me to like believe that you're like a fucking like libertarian? Like, what do you do? Like, I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd on its face. And honestly, yeah, like even a lot of like the liberal or sort of like, more progressive like Bitcoiners, like, yeah, they like just ignore it. They know it's there. Like they admit to it. They admit to it when you like talk to them about it in private, but everyone keeps their fucking head down, just like the Republicans keep their head down about Trump. It's kind of embarrassing, really.
Yeah, that's fascinating, man. I mean, I've still got a king on paper. We've just had our new 10-cent coins come out with Charles's face on them. But pulling on that, man, because look, I mean, what you're saying is true. I mean, there's the pictures of Joseph Goebbels and Hitler walking around looking at the degenerate art and saying, no, this isn't gonna fly. Yeah. And as you say, I mean, modern architecture, modern art, the criticisms of that. I mean, that cultural aestheticism is. It's interesting that that's coming out now. And I wonder if we can loop this back into maybe the broader situation that we're seeing, this maybe disenfranchisement with the way the world is working, a sense of utopianism, that there's maybe a better way, our declining kind of industrial base, etc. So, is there a broader zeitgeist that these concepts are feeding into, do you think? Or
yeah, I mean, I get it, right? Like, people are upset, and they're they've rejected liberalism. They've bought into this lie that you know that they've been lied to about everything, and so the answer to that is to go and find political influencers like on the right and in Bitcoin and all these other communities as sort of like their alternative sources of information, alternative truth oracles. And they've sort of export but they when they do that though, they just like go and export their critical thinking to people who make more money if they adopt the product that they're selling. So there's like automatic. I'm not like, look, I'm not trying to like say that everyone who works in like Bitcoin is just like, like that doesn't like actually like believe in sort of the mission. But like when you're fucking Michael Saylor, and you're telling everyone to buy Bitcoin was, well, you own billions of dollars of Bitcoin on the balance sheet of your company. So there is a conflict of interest there. You can say this has nothing to do with you getting rich and you're just taking advantage of something that you just happen to believe is good for humanity, and you would just and if this thing which is good for humanity were to come to fruition, you would just happen to be the richest person to ever exist, and one of these things has nothing to do with the other. There does come like a point where you're like, wait a second here, like maybe we need to have a conversation about this. These interests are very suspicious. If you're going to tell me that like you're mad at the fucking establishment because they make all this fucking money off of like everyone playing their game, well, it turns out if everyone comes and plays your game, you're going to be the richest person in the fucking world. So this is just like it's just like I don't know why this doesn't occur to people, that there's this like very obvious like question mark there on sort of like the fact that like it's not like it's not like you're just sort of like neutrally supporting this technology for the good of humanity. You're going to become the richest person in the fucking world if you're right. I mean, like that's that is at least the appearance of a conflict of interest. I think, right? I mean, I don't think is that controversial? I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting as well because, again, I'd be keen to talk about, your experience working in this world, working with Jack Dorsey and that, because it seems as if there's also a couple of sections within Bitcoin where you've got, what would call themselves OG, but, cypherpunks, people who say, look, we went through 2008, we've gone through debasement, we've gone through inflation, we don't like that, separate money and state. And then there's also this, Michael Saylor phenomenon, which is effectively the state, cloaked as, market operators. And then, this sort of political class has now come in, and a lot of people have raised their eyebrows at that. So, I mean, how do you see some of the nuance of sort of where Bitcoin came from and where it is at today?
I think like Bitcoin's like probably like here to stay. Like, I just want to be like clear. Like, I think that it's like found a sort of like a place, and we can kind of like talk about like how big of a place it might find in the world. I continue to believe it will not replace state currencies for a whole series of reasons, like related to the realities of political economy in the world. But like, and I've talked about that. I had a whole conversation with Peter McCormick on what Bitcoin did on like it's a multi-hour episode where I get kind of deep into my thoughts on that. You can kind of go there and check that out, so I don't have to rehash that whole argument here. But I mean, like, I think that there is. We live in a fragmented world, right? And there are people that are using Bitcoin for like good, right? Like the Russian opposition uses Bitcoin because like it's their only like real way to kind of get around the Russian banking system, because obviously the Kremlin doesn't allow political opposition to sort of like function within the Russian banking system. Like they just like steal the money right out of their bank accounts, basically, just like set their balances to zero. I mean, this actually happens to like political activists in Russia. And so like, I have like, I know people personally that are like literally like in the fight because of Bitcoin in Russia. And I acknowledge that. I think that's like, it's like, I'm glad, I'm happy that Bitcoin's keeping them in the fight. Of course, I'm a liberal, right? I want those fucking people to win. Um, but I mean, like, does that mean that Bitcoin should subsume our entire like financial system? Does that make sense? Should we do we need like politically neutral money? That's the question. It's an interesting question. I think, to a lot of people in the Bitcoin world, the answer to that question is yes. Obviously, money should be neutral. Well, I'm not sure that is true, right? It's not clear to me that it should be politically neutral. Like, I mean, it's okay, I think, at least in an abstract sense, unless you're an anarchist, to agree with the idea that government should be part of trying to set up the conditions for flourishing. And if you believe that structuring money in a way, even through legal fiction or through regulations or through forming market structures in a way that disincentivize things that one could reasonably argue would be contra to the interests of human flourishing, then like I don't see like the moral objection there in principle to that. So it's not, so that kind of comes to obviously the arguments that people in Bitcoin have about fiat currency. You mentioned like currency debasement. Everyone in this world likes to send the website what the fuck happened in 1971 across, and we look at all of these charts. Those charts, by the way, are kind of a bit like confused. We should just like be clear. One of the things that is not mentioned about the one of the reasons why we saw inflation take off. It really took off in 1973, not 1971. If you zoom in on those charts, do you know what happened in 1973? We had the oil embargo. After the the Iranian Revolution, which led to the oil shock. There was massive oil shortages around the world. Then we had the formation of OPEC, which basically cartelized like the global oil supply. And we never had cheap energy again after that. I mean, gasoline was like 1/7 the price, like literally at the end of the 60s, than it was like by the mid 70s as the result of this. And that fundamentally made the entire global economy, like it slowed the global economy down. It led to a lot of the malaise that we saw in the 1970s. This is why you get like the rise of Japanese cars and their fuel efficient engines, and people stopped buying big cars. People had to economize. Energy bills went through the fucking roof, electricity bills. That was actually the cause of a lot of the inflation. People, like, no one in the Bitcoin world ever fucking talks about that. They basically just want you to think what ended up happening in 1971 is after Nixon, blocked the gold redemptions, right, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, which obviously was threatened a potential like run on the bank. That what ended up happening was the U.S. just turned the fucking money printer on, and all of that inflation we saw was a result of newly printed money, chasing constant or slower growing supply. That's not what the data actually shows. If you actually back out the impact on consumer prices from the oil shock and the rise of OPEC, you actually like erase like at least in the 70s, like through into the 80s, like 90% plus of that inflation just goes away. So there's this like, I mean, the fact that the fucking Middle East like formed an oil cartel was the big reason we had inflation in the 1970s, not the end of Bretton Woods. That's I mean, you can go and check me and my math on that. Anybody, like, go and Google it and look through it. You can like do this. But like, I noticed that like for all of like the Bitcoin economists in this space that like talk about, macroeconomics and like the evolution of consumer prices, you never hear that mentioned. I mean, if they were actually like like good, reliable macroeconomists, you think that factor would have at least occurred to them, as to not just assume that a constant basket of goods at constant prices across time, which is like, basically the way that they back into these like weird theories around like how inflation's actually higher than they say, because look what happens if you plug the 1979 basket in here. Inflation is actually much higher than they said. So what they don't tell you is that a lot of the things that are a lot more expensive today than they were in 1979, like adjusted for the average industrial wage, is because people don't buy those things anymore because technology changed, right? Like it's a lot more expensive today to buy a car with a manual transmission in the United States than it is one with an automatic because of like economies of scale. It's like a specialty car. If you were tracking that as inflation, that wouldn't be the inflation in that price wouldn't primarily be driven by the presence of extra liquidity on the buyer side. It's a function of the fact that it's a smaller market now because consumer preferences have changed. And then people say, well, the CPI is unreliable because they use consumer survey data to basically renormalize the CPI. Well, what the fuck else are you supposed to do? Like, there's no objective standard on like what people should buy. Like I bought macaroni and cheese yesterday. Tomorrow I might buy potatoes. Maybe I'll decide I don't like those things at all anymore and I won't want them. And maybe everyone will agree with me and then no one will care what those things cost. This is why we do the consumer surveys for the CPI adjustment. This is why we hedonically weight these values. That's not a fucking conspiracy. It's the only thing that makes sense if you're going to measure inflation. So like honestly, like a lot of this shit that gets talked about by these Bitcoin economists is just fucking bullshit. It's bullshit that like leads out all this nuance of like that anybody who's like spent like half a semester in an economics program in economics, macroeconomics like 101 would just like immediately like see that they're just like they're selling their book and they're telling a dishonest story. Now, does that mean that inflation, the 2 to 5% inflation that we see sort of across the CPI, across the renormalized inflation rate isn't caused by money printing? No, it is. It is caused by money printing. Milton Friedman was right about that. I'm not disputing that. But the argument that the reason why the middle class stopped advancing for 20 years, starting in 1990, ending sometime around like 2014, before like productivity rates started rising again and we started seeing middle class wealth rise again, is like not obviously because of money printing. Like that's like actually I don't think people really understand why that happened. Various theories exist as to sort of like the way productivity, like service sector productivity, like lagged for like a long time. Some people think that was like the main driver. But I mean, like, I'm not even a fucking economist. I have no right to fucking be like, don't consider me an authority on economics, by the way. I know it sounds like I'm an economist, but it's just that I've like taken the fucking time to try and understand this. And I'm not an authority on this, but I know enough to know that these Bitcoin economists don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Okay. Thank you for that. Zooming out a little bit, I think it's interesting as well. If I'm going to be charitable about it, I think the 1971 thing is a very useful story for people, and it's a story that has been worked with. I mean, I did a deep dive into Angela Reddish, who wrote extensively about this, the connection with gold and how 1971 didn't really matter in the scheme of things. She wrote a great essay, Anchors Away. The gold chain, the anchor to gold has always been this kind of flexible thing, and the closing of the window was only just the final piece of that. It didn't really matter in the scheme of things, according to her. And the other charitable piece is looking at the role of central banking, which, there was high 10-15% inflation in the 1970s, but, they kind of fixed it in the 80s, and even my own country of New Zealand, we passed
Volcker shock. Volcker,
and they chased it down.
Yeah.
And even in my own country of New Zealand, they came out with a 2% target, and we nailed it. And so arguably there was kind of an innovation there. But I think if I'm going to be charitable, there's kind of ideological artifacts.
Bolivia had the massive shock.
Oh, I see.
Right?
But these ideological artifacts, something like the Bitcoin standard, it uses 1971 as a useful story, as a kind of a simplified narrative for the Bitcoin project, I think. And as you say, I mean, if you go into it, there is so much nuance there that you can't fit that all into a book that's kind of easily digestible. And so there's necessarily a political component here, I feel, Mike, which is that whether it's right or wrong in a historical sense, it's pushing the Bitcoin bandwagon. What do you call it? It's making people get on board with this. And the reality is, the thing is monetizing, and it's doing something we haven't seen before. With this kind of neutral money and this outside of the reach of the state. And so I guess if we situate those two, that there's maybe an ideology that's being pushed by these people, and then there's the reality of what Bitcoin's actually doing. I mean, how do we see between those?
Well, my view has always been, even when I was working on Bitcoin, is that I take an instrumentalist view of Bitcoin, right? It's technology. I think Bitcoin is technology, and I think technology is a tool. It's not telos, right? It's not an ends. And we never want technology to be an ends. We want ends to be human directed, based on our values. One of the things that can you convince me that politically neutral money is good? Yeah, I've made that argument. I gave a speech at the Bitcoin policy conference last year in Washington D.C. where I kind of gave my view on this. It's on YouTube. You can find it. And I listed out the ways in which I think Bitcoin can be useful in the world. But I've always been just really suspicious of these sort of what philosophers might call sort of totalizing notions, that once you sort of glom on to this new thing, you tend to some people might call it mission creep or feature creep, but there's sort of this ideological creep. It's sort of I think it's actually the same mistake that the neoliberals made in a sense, which was to think that wow, all this deregulation in the 80s massively juiced the economy and raised wealth and created all this prosperity. And so then the theory was, well, maybe we should just deregulate everything else, right? And then you get the 2008 financial crisis, right? Because which was largely attributed to say the deregulation, the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1997 under the Clinton administration. And I think within Bitcoin, when you're wow, this is this money or this money, you can't charge this, you can't have chargebacks. It's truly private. It's you don't necessarily, it's censorship resistant. And that, and we mentioned my friends in Russia who are fighting for their freedom, right, under the oppressive regime of Vladimir Putin. That's good, right? That censorship resistance, that political neutrality there is it's serving the interests of human flourishing, and I can get on board with that. But I kind of get off the boat when people are yes, but actually what we really need to do is what Bitcoin tells us, is that we now have the ultimate property. And if you don't know my key phrase in my head, then there's no way you can tax me. I don't have to pay taxes. I don't have to do anything. I'm a sovereign individual. And that's when I'm kind of what the fuck are you talking about? Wait, why that? What you No, I don't. I personally, I don't know. Just as a matter of being lazy, I don't know. But I'm joking. But when I say that, but I don't want to be responsible for contracting with my own police and my own fire service, and basically living in covenant communities where I have to fucking sign contracts, and everything in my relationship, everything in my world is a commercial relationship. What? Why do I want that? I don't want that. That's the most ridiculous thing in the world. In fact, I think our society is over financialized, quite frankly. So I mean that this is this sort of thinking in the Bitcoin world. I just think is like weird. It's like totalitarianism of a kind, right? I call it epistemic authoritarianism because it's like it creates this sort of like fatalistic notion that like the code is law. I'm like, okay, well, like, I mean, but like humans should be the ones that control the laws, right? Like we should be able to like control them, right? Like in theory, right? Like I don't want a human being a dictator, and I don't want a programmer who like decided on 21 million bitcoins being my fucking dictator either, quite frankly. Like I want the possibility to always exist that we can evolve our institutions, including our institutions of money, which I think is like fundamental to this liberal idea of like self-government. So this idea that like we should have like immutable algorithms that like define the contours of our economy or define the contours of law, or they become these like things that like nobody can change. That's like to me, I'm like, I think that's like epistemically authoritarianism, because it's like taking it's basically saying there's certain conversations that are off the table, that like technology has its own logic, and that society should shape itself and evolve like according to the logic of technology. And that's a form of political determinism. That's illiberal in a sort of like basic abstract sense. And so like my immediate response is like, no, like fuck that, let's not do that. Let's not commit ourselves to that world. Like, what if we're wrong? We were wrong about the neoliberal project. What if we're wrong about 21 million bitcoins? Like, what if that like fucks everything up and then we can't change it? I think that like I think that there's a certain like arrogance. There's a certain this idea that this idea is eternal. That there's an eternal truth here. That's always dangerous thinking. It's always it's dogmatic. It's fanatical, and at all points in history, whenever we've fallen into that trap, it's never turned out well. And so, I mean, I write. You mentioned my blog, Notes from the Circus, and I talk about this idea of like embracing tensions. Like sometimes things exist in tension, right? Like. I think collective rights and individual rights exist in tension. Libertarians will say there's no such thing as collective rights. I mean, I don't know what they're talking about. If you believe in the rule of law, then you believe in a collective right. You believe we have a collective right to enjoy both the benefits and protection of the law. That's a collective right. Like, surely collective rights exist. What the fuck are you talking about? If you say like, I mean, I think that all of these things are tensions that we have to negotiate, and we want to have the space. And a liberal like me thinks that the proper space for that is democratic deliberation, democratic participation, democratic elections, democratic institutions, in order to sort of like mediate our ability to have agency over our path through time and space in this like technological and scientific civilization that we've built for ourselves. And so like I don't like these notions of totalizing ideologies for that reason. It doesn't pass my sniff test, and so I reject it.
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is interesting. So I guess I'm part of this project. This podcast for me is a truth-seeking exercise, and you're speaking about things which are very interesting to me. You mentioned this idea of the sovereign individual, and there's a very famous book by the same name that sort of you'd be familiar.
Rees-Mogg and Mr. Davidson,
two very iconic or conservatives, I guess you could call them, from the UK. And looking at this role of technology and society, and this idea that somehow politics is downstream from technology. And I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, certainly the way it's outlined in that book, and others have talked about it, it seems that there is an affect. Technology does change the way we organize and the way we do things. And I wonder whether kind of charitably we look at Bitcoin as, from an instrumentalist point of view, as a technology. It changes the logic of money. Arguably changes the logic of violence. You can't take it if you don't have access to it. And I wonder whether there's actually a positive here, because coming back to sort of this opening quote of yours, looking at, this decline and this kind of perhaps dangerous path, what is the optimistic path? Because I certainly see democratic aspects to Bitcoin. I mean, you've worked in free and open source software. Anyone can build on it. There is sort of maybe a glimmer there for me, and that's part of why I'm interested in Bitcoin, that this actually is a better way. And so in that sense, is it more than technology? Can it actually be a social project that we all get behind increasingly?
Well, I mean, Bitcoin is a social project. All of our projects are social projects, by definition. A fiat currency is a social project. Bitcoin's a social project. You can't escape the fact that anything that usually involves more than one human being in our world that involves humans following patterns, adhering to rules, is by its very nature social. Is Bitcoin democratic? I mean, no. I mean, it's not inherently democratic or undemocratic, right? If you take the instrumentalist view, right? I mean, that's putting it sort of outside of sort of like the sort of a normative like frame. Can I imagine like Bitcoin existing like within a democratic world? Yeah, like of course. Like, can Bitcoin serve democratic means? Like, yeah, of course. I gave an example of that with like the Russian opposition. So that then the question, but then like, a lot of people, libertarians might not like then what I have to say. Like, yeah, I mean, I think we should regulate it. I think we should regulate the use of Bitcoin. I don't think that we should let people run rampant and like buy and sell like humans, like using Bitcoin on the dark web. I think governments should try to stop that from fucking happening. People hate like Chainalysis and these like, blockchain surveillance systems. Well, I mean, I do think we need to be able to investigate crime, right? I don't think we should allow antisocial behavior to go unchecked. Like we see what look what's happening right now. Like what happens when we have antisocial behavior going unchecked in the fucking White House right now. And actually, crypto is like a big part of that. I mean, Trump coin, are you like fucking kidding me? I mean, it's basically just like people just like buy Trump coin to like bribe the president in full public view. I mean, you could use Bitcoin for that, I guess, right? And like, do I think that like we should like undertake should governments feel like empowered to like, have the force of law come down against those activities and throw people in jail? Yeah, like fuck, absolutely, we should totally do that. And anybody who says that like that those financial transactions sort of exist in the ether beyond the reach of law, like I don't know what the fuck they're talking about. That's kind of like my stance. It's like fine, and it's like you can tell me like a compelling story, like especially like with say, I don't know, like international remittances and like human rights, like people using Bitcoin as like a politically neutral money. But do I think that like we should like make it a legal tender in the United States? No, I think that'd be fucking insane. No, we shouldn't do that. Absolutely not.
Interesting. Why not?
I mean, because like, I think that I don't think that having a credit-based money system is bad. Like, why? Like, I mean, I understand that like that this is like the Austrian view, and you get this like weird, like kind of like quasi like mystical political, like fucking stance around like time preference that like Austrians like always talk about. But like, they're like, well, I mean, like everyone's just gonna have really, really like, low time preference. We're going to have low time preference behavior. Everyone's going to consume less and be more discerning. It's going to be about quality, not quantity. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? I mean, these are fascist aesthetics, by the way. Like this is what I'm saying. This is like, and this is the fascist aesthetic, like right now, that like Bitcoiners don't realize that they're like saying. You're literally basically making a cultural argument around like how people should consume, how they should live, how they should think about value, how they should put off purchases until the future, and that they should delay gratification. This is like fascist virtue ethics. And the fact that like Austrians sort of like use that as sort of like the way in which they like get around like, Keynes's like arguments around like liquidity traps and demand destruction spirals, right? The paradox of thrift, which are like real like issues. We saw this happen in the Great Depression, and they're like, well, you don't have to worry about that because everyone will have low time preference, so we won't find ourselves in those like economic conditions. Like, have you met fucking humans? Like, you think that that's how they're gonna act? Like, what are you talking about? Like, you're making this like weird sort of like virtue ethics argument, and you're trying to pretend that it's like objective economics. It's not. It's like a fascist ethic, like mixed in with some like math.
Well, So, look, again, charitably, I mean, I understand what you're saying, Mike. I think when you look at the actual Austrian economics
Mm-hmm.
understanding and conception of money, I mean, a fixed
Mm-hmm.
base money and a flexible credit
Yeah.
money layer is what they always come back to. And in a roundabout way, I wonder whether that's not what we're seeing take place with these ETFs and someone like Saylor effectively creating a backstop for the US Fed and kind of fiat nothingness. And in that sense, you've got the digital gold
Yeah.
narrative. And so I think applying kind of a political judgment on that and saying it's fascist is maybe a little bit problematic. There's sort of certainly key people, raising their voices and talking about this stuff. But I mean, I
But I
see
mean,
it
but
certainly
Cody,
possible.
like, I mean, like, here's the thing, right? Like, I mean, look, I'm like, there's like always like shades of truth, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's like obviously the criticism of the Cantillon effect and the way in which, like, like certain market participants, like participants who can sort of participate in like primary markets, primary debt markets and stuff, sort of like are able in a sense to like arbitrage inflation across time, like and sort of like front run the Fed, and you have all these like kind of criticisms of that. And like, is there like truth to that? Yes, there is some truth there, and that's all, and it's always powerful to have a grain of truth that you can sort of build on, right? But like, the story kind of gets murkier though when you like go into the broader economy, right? Like, it is true. Like we created a lot of money in the financial crisis. Ben Bernanke dropped money from helicopters, like metaphorically, and injected a massive amount of money into the banking system. Some people think he didn't actually inject enough. Actually, that actually the recession, the recovery would have been somewhat faster if they had printed more money. And it's worth noting that, Ron Paul and Peter Schiff and all these people who were kind of basically saying that like the United States dollar was going to collapse within years, of all, these trillions of dollars of money being injected into the banking system. Um, uh, Liquidity, we didn't see high inflation for 10 years. Like CPI was like pretty fucking stable, right? From like 2010 to COVID, basically. We didn't see any of the inflationary effects that the Austrians predicted, in 2018, 2019. Their models were not validated by evidence. We have Japan, right, as like another as like another experiment. Like they had fucking deflation for nearly a decade. They took their interest rates negative and prices kept falling. Why did that happen? Because they have an aging population, right? And they had and so you get and they have very, very efficient production. Their manufacturing industry is like really, really efficient there. A lot of robotization, and so they have like falling consumer demand on one side, but like a lot of productive capacity on the other side, made up with automation. And like even with all that money printing, they couldn't stimulate enough demand, right? And so you get into and this is like what Austrians just never talk about. They never talk about the fact, and that's and obviously the rise of just-in-time manufacturing, the integrated manufacturing supply chains in Shenzhen, which like the whole world was able to use to basically create like elastic production. Like you could like go from 0 to like 1 million units in like fucking like 2 weeks, like with these like modern manufacturing methods that have been developed in the Shenzhen manufacturing supercluster there. And so you're just like, you can absorb a lot of liquidity in that world. And so what we actually saw was like a massive increase in global living standards, on the back of all that like money creation. And so that like really begs the question, like, was that immoral? Was that an immoral thing to do? I mean, like millions of people left poverty in that period, particularly in China and in Asia. I think, I know that after COVID, things started to get worse and we've lost some ground, and that's true, but things were recovering again until we decided to blow the world up in a fit of like right-wing rage. So like we didn't see the dollar collapse. Now, Obviously, there's like complexities there. The artificially low interest rates have led to the government being able to potentially like borrow beyond its means. There's obviously the risk of sovereign debt issues like in front of us here in the United States. It's a big worry. The 7% GDP deficit is a big fucking worry, and like that part's true, and there's like a relationship there. But like the Austrians weren't right. They weren't right. The whole thing was like supposed to like the dollar was supposed like inflation was supposed to go to thousands of percent or something by like 2012, 2013, like based on like everything the Austrians were saying. And that didn't happen. So then you have to be like, well, if the Austrian economic theory is like the objectively correct theory, then why isn't it predictive of anything? Why hasn't it successfully predicted anything? This is like basic shit. I mean, if you're going to claim that, like, as Seyfedin says, like Austrian economics is the true economics, well, surely it should have some predictive power then. I mean, like it doesn't appear to be true based on sort of the macroeconomic history. So, I mean, I understand that that people are like really committed to it and they think Austrian economics is like the end all and be all, but like I mean these are things that like these Austrian economists should answer for. They should have good responses. They won't debate me. I've challenged Seyfedin to a debate. I've wanted to debate him on all these things, but he's too much of a wimp to do it. But like I mean like they don't want to debate me because they don't have an answer to any of these questions.
Fascinating. Yeah. Oh, look, man, I guess there's a cultural, moral lens that we're looking at this through. There's a technology lens. I guess what I'm seeing around me, I mean, certainly, there is a lot of smart people who are working on this and who have looked at it closely, who maybe brush away the more simple stories that are being told. It's kind of the fairy tale of 1971 is useful for a lot of people, and a lot of people have read that book and they got into Bitcoin, and they've seen their Bitcoin go up in value. And so there's kind of like a sub-project there, which I think maybe in itself isn't fully factual necessarily, but it's still useful to the project. At the same time, I mean, there are people very unhappy with the system, and that's got a social mimetics to it, like this anti-establishment,
they're very unhappy with
populism that you're writing about. And I wonder, where does this go to? Because I'm trying to work out what's going on as well, Mike, and I think, this is certainly capturing a lot of people's attention, and they say, hey man, I can't buy a house, I can't even buy groceries this week, my money's worth less, I'm going to blame the government. I think that's there is a grain of truth to that, but what does that mean moving forward?
Look, I mean, people are right to be angry, right? I mean, there's been serious failures of governance. It has to be said that technocratic liberalism has sort of like failed as a project. I acknowledge that. I've written really scathing pieces about technocratic liberalism, on my piece. Like some of my earliest pieces on Notes from the Circus was actually criticizing neoliberal and technocratic liberalism. And I agree with those notions. I understand why people are angry, and those criticisms, they carry weight. I share a lot of those criticisms. Where I get off the bus is like, to your point, people are really angry, they're mad at the system. I think that they should be mad at the failures such as they are, right? I mean, the reason why no one can afford to buy a house is because we don't build houses. Like supply in the United States. I mean, I don't know about New Zealand or Australia, although I know that like Sydney is a very housing restrictive city. They don't allow much building there. If anyone wants to like know a lot about this, like best book on like understanding this is by a guy named Edward Glaser. It's a book called Triumph of the City. You should totally read this book. And it actually, a big part of that book actually is on Sydney, Australia, actually, and kind of going into like some of the problems there. And we've seen this, right? Like Seattle is like probably the most affordable like urban housing market now in the United States. Why? Because the city kind of just like went radical and just started like approving zoning permits, and they've built like dozens and dozens and hundreds of condo towers in Seattle over the last like 5 to 7 years, and rents have come down. Surprise, surprise. Even though people are moving there, the population's going up and rents are going down. Why is that happening? Supply is coming on the market. I mean, the main problem is the fact that, I'm here in like California, and California is like, pretty much the worst in the United States, like when it comes to the political economy around land use. We have this like thing here called like Prop 13. It was like passed in the 1970s as part of the tax revolt, back when Reagan was governor, and it like basically did this insane thing here, which basically it locks property taxes at the moment that you take title of a property. So whatever the property taxes are the day that you buy a house in California, those will be your property taxes forever. And so what ends up happening is as real estate prices, asset prices increase, basically the delta between your like home equity and the tax servicing costs becomes like really advantageous to basically bank the house, to land, what some people call like land bank or real estate banking, and just basically getting rich off of the restriction of supply without having kind of the sort of the countervailing force of having to pay higher higher property taxes, against the asset appreciation, as happens in most of the rest of the country, right? Most jurisdictions reassess property values every few years. Some do it every few years. You don't do that in California. Prop 13 made that illegal. And they made it also really hard to change the law. You need 60% plus one, or 66% plus one or something, votes in a referendum to overturn it. It needs a 2/3 majority to remove it. And it's just created a giant landowner cartel in California, and that's why no one can afford to fucking live here. It has nothing to do with like with the fiat currency. Like if it did, then why are prices going down in Seattle even as its population goes up? It's because they got radical about building a lot of housing and allowing developers to build housing, and so that's the problem. It's actually that simple. And so like that's like the issue there. This idea that if we just like were on the Bitcoin standard, that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, if you had a rising population and a static housing supply, this is basic supply and demand 101. Eventually people are going to get priced out of that market. And that's what we've seen happen across the Western world. That is not something that's a feature of the monetary system. That is a feature of artificially restricted supply, at least here in the United States, and most of the rest of the world at the local planning level. And there's like this like insidious like relationship between homeowners and the politicians in local jurisdictions that's very biased towards protecting incumbency, so people can use their houses as piggy banks. That's the problem. I mean, that's not a problem of our money. That's a problem. That's a market failure of like it's market capture. It's regulatory capture by homeowners, basically.
Interesting. I mean, arguably the piggy bank of the house, though, is because the money isn't able to be saved in the bank. But that aside, I am interested in just sort of wrapping up, Mike, and kind of coming back to this idea of hope and the opportunity, because I think we've certainly explored a few things. There's a little bit of darkness that we didn't go into today, looking at Curtis Yarvin, the cathedral, these ideas which are problematic. We don't need to go there today, but what gives you hope? Because when I look at Bitcoin, I look at something like the foundation of the United States project, I look at some of the ideas of self-sovereignty in that sense, what it means to have at least some degree of autonomy from the state and to be able to live and prosper and these kinds of things. That makes it a very American idea, I think, and there's certainly a lot of good in there that I can see, and it's certainly been good to me. So I guess being hopeful doesn't have to be about Bitcoin, but what are you hopeful about, Mike? What are you looking forward to?
Well, I mean, I'm not, when you ask me like what gives me hope, right? I mean, I want to just like maybe like explore the stance, right? Of like, I don't have despair. I don't despair about this like current moment. I would say that like I have eternal hope. To quote Camus, right? At the end of the myth of Sisyphus, that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, right? That like, I mean, look, I mean, we live, we live in the tragic dimension, you know. We live in this sort of like liminal place, right, between heat and cold, and hot and cold, and alive and dead, full and empty. We live in a sort of a thermodynamic dance, right, between coherence and entropy. And we live in this like really delicate place, right, at the top of this like really complicated tapestry of reality. This really like sort of like beautiful place that like by all accounts should collapse into noise, and yet it doesn't. And yet we sit here and we exist, and there's something beautiful about that. And you can like just sit yourself there and realize that like reality is beautiful, and the world is filled with so many beautiful things. Like even with all these things that are happening around us, even as we have to face the manifest stupidity of ourselves, which is on full display every fucking day in this country, out of Washington D.C., we can still like recognize, right, that meaning is possible, that our lives could be meaningful, that not that everything that's meaningful doesn't have to be some like massive grand gesture that like changes history. I mean, I think something as simple as a hug, of a friend that you haven't seen in a long period of time, and that moment, right, is like, this that sort of a warm moment of like human connection. Like think about like when you haven't seen someone for a long time and you hug them and you feel that physical contact and realize that they're there, and you feel your chests up against each other. I mean, like that, like sort of like just sort of like that beautiful sort of like reminder, right, that like we're not alone, that we're like here like together. That's where I live. It's not, I'm not out there looking for hope. As it pertains to these conversations, I'm just like trying to like be my like authentic self. I'm just like at this point, like, I mean, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing right now. I'm writing on this like blog, and all I'm doing is just telling people what I happen to think is like the capital T truth, and what I think, and like and what my position is, with like no bullshit. And I'm not trying to be like malicious. I think I'd like to be able to keep hugging people in the future. I'd prefer that this experiment not end. This human experiment. I think, and I'd like to live in a free world, one where human dignity isn't something that we negotiate. It's not something that we argue about who has it and who doesn't. That we accept that human dignity is a universal thing. And for that reason, like I continue to attach myself to this idea of liberalism and democratic institutions within that, and I continue to fight for and try to enchant the idea that maintaining a liberal polity and basic liberal values is the way that like we'll keep living in a world where we can hug our friends and really appreciate the truth of love and companionship. That's so yeah, I mean, that's how I view it. I'm not sitting on a landscape of despair looking for hope.
I'm glad to hear that. I think being in a place where you can feel what you've just described, you can look at the world with clear eyes. I mean, it's a beautiful place to be, and it can also be a bit lonely. You can see things happening around you. Yeah. Movements take place, masses form, people get swept up into things that that you can see are not going to be good for them, yet they still do it. And this is kind of the great cycle of history, and it's not the first time that we've been bound up in this sense of populism.
We live in history.
A sense of righteousness.
Turns out we live in history. The history did not end. We did not. The Fukuyaman moment was a lie, it turns out.
History did not end. Well, look, Mike, really appreciate your time. It's been an excellent conversation. I've enjoyed reading your work, and certainly thought-provoking. I think we need to be having more conversations.
Yeah, anytime.
So yeah, very much appreciated. If people want to follow Notes from the Circus, they want to follow you, where do you want to send them?
I mean, you can go to notesfromthecircus.com. It's my Substack. All my stuff's free. Some of my stuff gets paid for my like sort of like bigger essays that I spend more time on. They get paywalled for 5 days, but everything ultimately becomes free after 5 days. And so I'm trying to I'm trying to get the word out there, but also make the work a little bit sustainable. So everyone's welcome, and I appreciate people's comments, and I'm always open to. I'm always open to discuss people. People will see that when I get good questions and stuff, and I usually take the time to respond in the comments thoughtfully and stuff. So I'm always looking to engage in an intellectual conversation with people interested.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.